I've asked this many times before, but how can the religious actually know anything about their gods? They certainly claim to, but how can they come to those conclusions rationally? Because most of the time, they just start with the emotionally comforting belief that their gods are the way that they think that they are, all of which is arrived at completely blindly, and then they steer the fail train to that belief whether it wants to go there or not. Religion really is asinine. So let's see another example. I ran into this article over on Strange Notions, which, yes, is rather appropriate, explaining how theists, especially Christians, can know things about their imaginary friends. You know, the same old tired nonsense that we see time and time again. But wow, it really is absurd just how many hoops this guy, Joe Hirschmeyer, jumps through in order to justify his blind and absurd faith. So let's go through the article and see just where he goes wrong. Or rather, try to find anything that he actually does right. I wouldn't be holding my breath. Can we actually know anything about God? This is one of the most fundamental questions, and many people, particularly agnostics, will say no. The argument tends to go something like this. God, if there is a God, is so far removed from human experience and knowledge that there's nothing that we can say about him or her or it. Another variation. The only way to verify our knowledge about God would be to die and find out if heaven and hell exist. For those of us still alive, we can't be sure. Except none of that really helps you out one bit. I had this same discussion with a theist on Reddit a couple of hours ago, and it didn't help them out any more than it did the writer of this article. See, the problem is, it's all based on assertions, yanked solidly out of someone's asshole, and wishful thinking. You can substitute just about anything for the word God, and really not change the argument substantially. So let's try it. Bobo the tree god, if there is a Bobo the tree god, is so far removed from human experience and knowledge that there's nothing that we can say about him. How is that any different from anything that anyone can say about Yahweh or Allah or Krishna or anyone else? Because I'll be honest, I see Christians and other religions saying the exact same thing about their gods when they argue with atheists. Why? Because they think they know all these things that they simply have no way of knowing. It's really just ridiculous. So, what can we believers, and particularly we Christians, say to these objections? Well, I'll tell you what you ought to say. You ought to acknowledge that they're correct and stop believing things for which you have absolutely no proof. As I said, I just had a discussion on this very subject, and the theist tried every single argument that will appear in this article and didn't get anywhere either. Everything here relies on faith, but faith is empty and absurd. So long as that's all they have to go on, they aren't going to get anywhere useful. And you notice that theists, they don't apply these standards evenly to every conceivable God. They only do it to their own. That tells you right there that the whole thing is absurd and irrational on its face. But there are 3 points that the author wants to make, so let's get to those so we can see just how ridiculous this whole thing really is. In an earlier post, I pointed out that one of the ways that we can establish the existence of absolute knowable truth is by showing that statements like absolute truth does not exist, we can't know anything for certain, I don't know if we can know anything for certain, and all truth is empirically or scientifically testable, are self-refuting. If you haven't read it or want a refresher, I encourage you to check it out because this post builds upon that line of argumentation. Now, granted, I haven't read his earlier posts, nor do I really care to because I've read a lot of things similar in the past. But if someone wants to follow his link and tell me that I'm wrong about everything I'm about to say, please feel free. You will notice that a lot of theists play these ridiculous semantic games. And that's really all they are. Games. Nobody says absolute truth does not exist. I've never heard anyone, except for the religious, ever say that, ever. This goes back to an observation that I and other atheists have made about the religious. They seem to think that we are just like they are. We operate on faith. We desperately want to believe to somehow fill that imaginary God-shaped hole that we all have in our hearts, etc. Of course, none of that is actually true at all. We do not think as they do, or more properly, we don't blindly believe as they do. We actually do think, and we do care if what we allow into our heads is factually correct in the real world. He's already doing very poorly. No one says any of those things, and no one thinks the way that he does. What we actually say is that anything that is not demonstrably real and true in objective reality, it isn't worth our time believing. Because no God can be demonstrated to be real, and we're not going to be bothered believing in anything not real. You're going to have to do a whole lot better than that. But what do I mean to say that these objections are self-refuting? I mean that to claim that God is unknowable is A, to claim that we cannot know his attributes, and B, to assign him an attribute unknowability. Except that's exactly what you do. You claim to know God's attributes, but you cannot demonstrate any means for actually coming to that conclusion objectively. How do you know what God is like? Where did you get that information? And how did you test it to see if you got it right? Of course, the religious are certainly not the only ones guilty of this. I grew up reading Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods and other pseudoscientific woo like that, and if you pay any attention to the UFO nuts, they're just as happy to tell you all about space aliens and what they're like, what do they want, and how we'd better listen. But as with gods, how do they know? Where do they get that information objectively and demonstrably? Because they didn't. They're just telegraphing their own wants and desires into these super powerful creatures that they've made up as a means to get direction in their lives. This kind of thing is as old as the species, and it isn't getting any better. The ancient Greeks and Romans did it for their gods, and the religious still do it today. People, unfortunately, are dumb. It's kind of pathetic. If you tell me I can't tell you anything about my neighbor because he's so introverted that we hardly speak, you've just told me something about your neighbor. Here, the agnostic is basically calling God a cosmic introvert who keeps to himself so radically that we can't know anything about him. If that were true, we couldn't know him to be an introvert. Well, at least you can know that your neighbor exists, which is something that you certainly cannot do with any God. You have presumably seen your neighbor. You haven't seen God. There are publicly accessible records on your neighbor that can be verified. What can you do with God? Your next door neighbor lives in a house, and you can prove that house exists, can't you? I mean, go knock on the wall or the door. It's really there. But what about God? Can you prove that there's a heaven where this God of yours resides? No, you can't do that. It's all wishful thinking all the way down. So your first point is entirely nonsense. Let's see if this gets any better. Causality tells us quite a bit more than we tend to acknowledge. To show this, I want to point out a few basic aspects of causation. Yeah, this isn't starting out well. Causality is a red herring of the highest order. It makes assumptions that you simply cannot make by asserting that things that exist now have always existed or must always exist. Again, how do you know that, and how have you tested your assertion? Now, there are places that causality does demonstrably apply, and that's fine. We know that if you throw a ball into the air, it comes back down due to gravity. No matter how many times you personally throw that ball up into the air from the ground level, it's going to come back down again. But if you throw it in the air from space or mount it to a rocket and launch it into the sky, then your assumption may be completely wrong. We can only apply the laws of physics that we know to the universe that we currently inhabit because, so far as we can tell, this is the only place that they may apply. But the religious don't do that, do they? So let's continue and watch him fail. If you open your umbrella and it suddenly explodes, the first thing that we can establish is that the cause was something capable of causing an umbrella to explode. That point seems so basic as to be unworthy of mention. But it actually tells us quite a bit, and it's a universal truth that we can describe this way. If X caused Y, X must be the sort of thing capable of causing Y. And here's a tactic that the religious employ a lot. Once you know about it, you're going to be looking for it because it's everywhere. It's the idea that you should stop asking questions and just accept things because they aren't worth examining. It's so obvious that you should just blindly believe. That explains why they believe so many truly asinine things, doesn't it? If you open your umbrella and it explodes, then there are many possible explanations for why it did so. You can't just assume that the laws of the universe magically changed so as to make the umbrella explosive. At least not without evidence. Notice here that he says that it's a universal truth. But rest assured that soon he will start talking about things outside of the universe, thus making these universal truths wholly irrelevant. Just wait. The second thing that we should notice is that an effect can't be greater than its cause, or the sum of its causes in the cases of things with multiple causes. Or conversely, every cause must be equal or greater to its effects. If you've got 8 ounces of juice, you didn't get that from squeezing 2 3-ounce oranges. The equal or greater part here is important. Whoever left $50 on your table must have had at least $50, but could have started with much more. You simply don't know that when it stops being contained within our particular universe. But of course, he doesn't want you to stop and think about that, does he? He just wants you to accept his premise without pausing in the future to think if it applies. This is very typical theist nonsense that you will see constantly in these religious arguments. Because the religious have to go on feelings, not on facts. They can't think about things too much or, it all falls apart. So they just, well, this is how it kind of seems to me, or this is how it applies in this situation, and therefore it applies in all situations. And I'm sorry, but it just doesn't work that way. Finally, everything present in the effect must be present, at least in potency, in the cause. This is really just the logical implication of our first rule, stated more explicitly. If you start with just a few strips of uncooked bacon, you can't end up with a peanut butter sandwich. It's not a question of whether bacon or peanut butter is superior. It's just a recognition that bacon isn't the type of thing that has the potential to become a peanut butter sandwich. Yeah, that's not necessary at all. If an earthquake causes a rock to roll down a hill, the effect, the ball rolling, is not really present in the cause, plate tectonic movement. The potentiality is situational. If the rock is not at the top of the hill, all the earthquakes in the world are not going to make it roll down. And again, this has absolutely nothing at all to do with gods. It's just a bunch of claims that he will apply to gods and expect people not to ask any questions. It's really dishonest at its core, because if you think about it, okay, here you have a god, whether it's made of bacon or peanut butter. But that god, which is not physical according to the religious, how does that make things that are physical? I don't know. None of that is in the potency of the God itself, is it? But, don't think about that too much because it just makes the whole thing look stupid. Here again, I'm pointing out things so basic that they ought to be uncontroversial. But these insights turn out to be of great importance when you look at the entire universe. And here, I really do mean the entire universe. The natural phenomena like subatomic particles and chimpanzees and supernovas and beautiful sunsets, but also the man-made bits like iPhones and symphonies. Even these human artifacts are the products of human ingenuity, and humans are creatures, created beings, so he says. If you say that iPhones are created by Steve Jobs, you have to explain what created the creature Steve Jobs. Once again, he's doing exactly what I predicted. Here are things that are true of our universe, and I won't argue that part. But what if you're talking about things beyond the universe, or that happened before the universe came into existence, or after the universe ceases to be? Those agreements are going to be null and void, because beyond the boundaries of our universe, those constraints may or may not exist at all. But he wants to tell you not to think about anything that's coming up too hard, because if you do, it's all going to fall apart. And unfortunately for him, we're going to do exactly that. Anyone who knows Aquinas' 5 ways should recognize this line of argumentation, and the way that it points to an uncaused cause. Instead of tracing those familiar lines, let me just point out a few of the implications that you might not have considered. First, we're looking for the sort of cause capable of creating an entire universe, not just sparking a cosmic chain of events, mind you, but keeping all of reality in existence at every moment. Second, we can see that the universe was caused by something equal to or greater than the entire universe combined. And finally, everything in the universe must be present in some way in the cause. This doesn't just point to God, but a specific sort of God. And that's why Aquinas fails so badly. Now, I've looked at the 5 ways in the past, if you want to go look up some videos, but it's all a bunch of hand-waving nonsense, just like this is. Essentially, he says that because the world that we see right now has cause and effect, all conceivable worlds must also have cause and effect, and that's a completely unsupported and also currently unsupportable assertion. Again, please ask yourself just how he knows any of this. The second you start doing that consistently, you're going to see all of the absurd logical fallacies that religion relies on. So let's look at some of his. First, he says that he's looking for some kind of cause capable of creating an entire universe. That shows right there that he's pushing this into a mold. He's looking for something that created the universe. He's implying a creation. He's implying purpose. That's not in evidence. Sorry. Secondly, he says that the universe was caused by something equal to or greater than the entire universe. But that doesn't mean that that thing was intelligent, sentient, had any purpose in mind for the universe, etc. Doesn't say anything about any of that. Third, he says that everything in the universe must be present in the cause. Well, I already pointed out that can't be the case, because his God is non-physical, non-corporeal. It's not anything that follows the physical laws of our universe. If that's the case, then our universe could not have come from that supposed cause. Guys, think about this. Don't just read the stupid words on the page. Think about it. It's not that difficult. We're looking here at an intelligent and personal creator. Since he created personality and intelligence, he must possess at least this much. He must be good because he's the cause of goodness. The same for love and the rest. Now, here, I anticipate an objection from certain shrewd non-believers. I love how he calls us shrewd, like that's a bad thing. Namely, if we can say that God is good because he's the cause of goodness, why can't we equally well say that he's evil if he's the cause of evil? No, you are desperately trying to reach an intelligent and personal creator without actually going through the steps to demonstrate that you have one. Because this imaginary friend of yours must, by definition, exist outside of our universe. Because he doesn't follow any of the physical laws that govern everything in our universe. All of these assumptions that they're making about God simply do not hold true, or at the very least, they require additional validation that they simply cannot provide. But let's really look at these claims here. Now, I know he pointed this out already, but we're going to go into it. It says that God must be good because he's the cause of goodness. Well, what about evil? Really, what about evil? Because even the Bible says that God causes evil. So that makes God evil. And God must be cancer because God causes cancer. Otherwise, cancer couldn't exist. And leprosy and COVID-19. I mean, where does it end? But he says he'll answer my objection, so let's see what he says. There are a lot of answers to this. A simple explanation would be that a great artist can make a bad work of art, but a bad artist can't make a great work of art. The same Picasso who achieved a masterpiece in science and charity, while a young teenager went on to make junk like Bather opening a cabin. The second piece could have been created by a great or terrible artist, but the first betrays Picasso's off-hidden genius. A great god could create a universe with things inferior to himself. A lousy god couldn't create a universe with things greater than himself, since that would violate our second rule. Except in that case, good and bad are entirely subjective. There are plenty of people who are really not impressed by Picasso at all, instead preferring Cubist art or something similar. There is no objective standard of art, thus this example simply doesn't hold water. Now, I agree that there isn't any objective standard of good or evil either, which might be an out for the theist, but it would also mean that he couldn't claim that God is good, because good is a subjective concept. What you think of as good in your own opinion is just your own opinion. It isn't objectively and demonstrably true of absolutely everybody else. But don't think about that too hard because, you just have to listen and believe. If we want to go deeper into metaphysics, evil is a privation, a sort of metaphysical parasite on good, without any ontological existence of its own. Also, and this is clearer if you're willing to look at Revelation, who would be, God isn't the cause of evil, even though it says so in the Bible, which is why Christians and Jews ascribe the existence of moral evil to man's turning away from an all-good God, not to any fault within God. So the objection is faulty in how it understands both evil and its relationship to the Creator. And how do you know exactly what that relationship is? You haven't explained that yet. Come on, how do you know that? Why isn't good a privation of evil? I can think of all kinds of examples of supposed good that really isn't good, just as I can think of lots of examples of supposed evil that isn't actually evil. Our theist here is simply making a bald assertion that he's right without being able to back any of it up. Why? Because that's how the religious operate. This is how rationalizations work. You start with a preconceived notion that God is good in this case, then you twist it and turn it around in your head until you can justify to yourself that it must be true, because you really want it to be true. He's counting on the fact that his audience is already going to agree with him, so he doesn't have to actually verify any of it. It's a bunch of biased theists all desperately trying to reach the same goal. And that's not how any of this actually works in reality, is it? Thus far, we've looked at the way that human reason can arrive at sure knowledge of God's existence and come to know some things about Him. But there's a limitation in all of this. We're working from creation toward the Creator. If you'll permit the analogy, we're acting a bit like detectives at a crime scene. In the same way that Sherlock Holmes or CSI type might conclude that the evidence left at the scene that the killer must have been left-handed, just under 6 feet tall, and a cat owner, we've found that the Creator of the universe is a personal and loving God greater than the whole universe. But at this point, we still don't know God, just as the detective doesn't actually know the killer. We just know about God, and those aren't the same thing. I'm sorry, but we've done nothing of the sort. We've just watched you dance around, making claims and pretending that your claims must be true because you desperately want them to be. Nothing you've said has pointed to a God, much less your specific God. But you're not really concerned with that. I could claim that all of that proves that invisible, intangible, universe-creating pixies are real. Why not? I'm just doing what our theist here is doing. If Sherlock Holmes operated like this, he'd be laughed right off the crime scene. You can't start with a conclusion that you like and then desperately backfill in claims of evidence that invariably lead to the conclusion that you want to reach. At no point do we know any more about your God than your claims. There's no evidence whatsoever to examine. Maybe you ought to get on that. To know God, something more than our effort is required. What's required is for God to reveal Himself. Reason tells us that the God we're describing is the type to reveal Himself, since He A. loves us, B. created us with the desire to know and love Him, and C. is powerful enough to bring it about. But reason alone can't tell us whether or not He actually did. Fortunately, history can answer that question. And how do you know that? Because again, this is just an assertion made without any evidence whatsoever. Reason has nothing at all to do with these claims. Only emotion does. You are asserting that God loves you or created you, but those are simply not in evidence. This is no different than primitive nature religions, people worshiping nature spirits and mountains and rivers because those things seem powerful to them. You're just moving the goalposts back a couple of steps, but it doesn't demonstrate that your imaginary friend is actually real. You have to do a whole lot better than this. Thank God, Jesus Christ, God Himself, entered into history in the 1st century. He went around publicly, A, claiming divinity for Himself, while B, claiming moral truths that even a great many non-believers like Jefferson and Gandhi recognize as a source of invaluable wisdom. Eventually, his enemies had enough of him, and C, he was publicly tried, executed, and buried. Shortly thereafter, D, he rose from the dead, a fact confirmed by the empty tomb in which he was buried and the testimony of several eyewitnesses who saw him risen. These eyewitnesses were cruelly tortured and executed, and yet none of them recanted. Well, that's your claim. I'm not saying that there aren't some good ideas in the Bible, but there's an awful lot of really horrible ones there too. It's a mixed bag at best, and anything in there of value can be achieved just as easily, both from other non-religious sources and by just thinking about it for yourself. But the religious, they don't want to think, do they? They just want to mindlessly believe. It's really all they have, as this entire article has clearly demonstrated. It's starting off with a conclusion for emotional reasons, then leaping all over the map, desperately trying to get back to that conclusion that they wanted to get to in the first place. And of course, he just assumes that all of the things written about in the Bible actually happened. Again, without being able to back any of it up independently. We have no evidence that any of the disciples ever existed at all, because we can't even prove they were real. All of the stories of the torture and the executions and all of that, those mean absolutely nothing. But the religious aren't concerned with demonstrable truth. They've just got an ego to stroke. This evidence, taken together, points to a single conclusion. Jesus of Nazareth really was and is who he claims to be. That is not a blind act of faith, but a reasonable assessment of the historical evidence. The full historical evidence, including writings written by both supporters and opponents of Christ's. But all of this also brings us to a sort of jumping off point, because what's really needed here is an act of faith. We saw in part 1 that it's irrational to claim that God is completely unknowable, and in part 2 that we can come to know certain admittedly limited things about God. But to get beyond this, to get to really know him, you need to do what you would do with anyone else you want to get to know. Have a conversation. All right, this is silly. It really is. What evidence exactly are you talking about? Because you haven't presented anything. You are not using that word the way that rational people do. When we talk about evidence, we mean specifically the available body of facts, demonstrable, objectively verifiable facts and information, things that you can specifically point to, not claims in a book, things that you can show are true, indicating whether or not a belief or proposition is true or valid. It has nothing at all to do with our feelings like everything else you're doing here. It has to do with facts. Of course, he doesn't want to actually examine any of this supposed evidence in detail because he doesn't actually have any. He has a book of mythology to which he's emotionally attached and a goal in mind that he's going to get to, truth be damned. This entire article is a joke, just like every other apologetic article we ever look at. It's all a bunch of question-begging nonsense, assuming the truth of the conclusion before ever examining the evidence to get to that conclusion at all. None of this follows basic logical dictates for discovering demonstrable truth. It is an emotional exercise in futility. It's what makes religion such an absurd joke. At a certain point, your answer won't come in a book or a blog post about him, but in dialogue with him on your knees. Share with him your doubts and struggles, express your love for him, admit your faults and shortcomings, and embrace him as your Lord. That's not the end of the spiritual life, of course, but it's a great way to start. And that's yet another assertion, that you can talk to your imaginary friend and somehow he'll answer back in no way that you can demonstrate. Somehow. Maybe. Kinda. If you don't think about it too much. Or maybe it's just you talking to yourself, but, the religions don't like to acknowledge that part, do they? But it only works for them, right? Because when members of other religions talk to their gods and get the same kind of answers back, well, that's not proof that their gods are real, is it? It's proof that some imaginary devil figure out there is responsible. Only their imaginary devil figure, though, because Christians can't imagine that, a Hindu shaitan or Rakshasa or whatever is to blame for their experiences. No, it's all just their own mythology and no one else's that works. Because these people just aren't that smart to begin with. This is why none of these articles or videos impress me in the least, because these people just aren't using their brains for anything but holding their hats up. I don't care what you believe. I don't care what you feel. I don't care what you have faith in. I don't care about your delusions or anything else. I care about what can be demonstrated to be true with objectively verifiable evidence. And so long as they have nothing, and the author of this article clearly doesn't, then you're just being an idiot, and you need to figure out how rational people operate. You are not a rational person when it comes to your religion, if you believe any of these things at all. I trust nobody's surprised because, jeez, I know I'm not.
Bum